They say history repeats itself, but it was all done in one take. Hello and welcome to History Unscripted, where we, a film buff and a history nerd, get together to give you the truth behind your favourite films. This is part 4 of our series on The Last Samurai. Let's go. We're back.
Back in the attic.
Episode 2 in the attic.
It's raining, and it's windy, and there are cracks in the ceiling here.
But I have put my iPad on a cushion, so now you won't hear that in the background.
Yeah.
One problem solved, 2 more appear.
Yeah, this is the first time that we've recorded anything in a room together. We're working with one microphone, because we can't figure out how to get 2 microphones to work in one laptop. So you're going to have to bear with us on the technical side of things. We are trying our best.
We are surrounded by cardboard boxes and some of my old rubbish paintings from my teenage years.
I wouldn't say it's rubbish. Maybe teenagery.
Yeah. A bit over-emotional, maybe.
Yeah, a little dramatic.
Yeah.
But lovely enough anyway. It's nice. It's the only place in the house we have any privacy. So
nice to be surrounded by art while we create art. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And speaking of art, what was our new name again? Oh, yes. History Unscripted.
History Unscripted. No longer, well, can't say that, redacted.
Welcome back to the show. This is another episode of History Unscripted, and you're joining us for part 4 on our series of The Last Samurai. We will be, sadly, wrapping up our series on the true Last Samurai, Saigo Takamori, who's been the protagonist for the past 3 episodes.
And what happens to him? He wins and he completes the mission and he becomes emperor and he lives forever? Is that sort of where the story's going?
It's close. He sort of dies in a muddy field.
Okay, brilliant. Well, it's a sad end, but a great story anyway. So let's hear about it.
Yeah, I might be slightly underselling it there. It's a bit more badass than just dying in a muddy field, although there is a muddy field and he does die in it, but he dies at what's known as the fabled Battle of Shirayama, which is pretty famous and is essentially the entire inspiration for the Last Samurai movie.
But when we left him, he had just left the Meiji government, right? So how does he get from returning to his homeland for a peaceful life to dying once again in battle in a muddy field?
Well, we shall get certainly into that indeed. However, a few bits of administration up top. First of all, I say at the beginning of every episode these days, we'd love it if you could engage with the show. So if you are listening on Substack, then you can give it a like, you can give it a share, you can add to your recommendations. If you're on Spotify, you can follow us or leave us a review. That'd be very helpful. If you're listening on YouTube, like and subscribe. And wherever you're listening, just, any sort of engagement with the show, it would be very helpful. Let us know what you think about it as well. You can leave us comments, you can send us an email, or you can reply to us on Substack as well. We'd love to hear what you think about the show.
Remember, find our house, throw a brick through our window. If that works for you.
Yeah, exactly. You can write messages on a piece of paper and then sellotape them to bricks and throw them through the window, and we will be sure to reply with our own bricks, perhaps. We can find out where you live.
So admin out the way. Let's recap in case you're just joining us. Who is Saigo? Where are we? What's happening? What's happened so far?
So, last episode, Saigo had led his forces. Saigo, I say the inspiration for Katsumoto in The Last Samurai, in real life had led his forces and defeated the Tokugawa shogunate at the Battle of Toba-Fushimi. He had then marched on Edo and had negotiated a bloodless surrender, which allowed the shogunate to surrender with honor, and his old enemy Keiki was allowed to retire from private life.
A classic Saigo move, that.
Yeah, indeed.
Peaceful surrenders.
Then the Meiji Restoration was proclaimed. Emperor Meiji declared an oath that he would transform his country into a modern nation-state. Saigo was pressured into joining the government, although he wasn't very keen on it, but he sort of begrudgingly obliged and was whisked off to Tokyo to become one of the 3 most important men in this new Meiji government.
And then he was sort of in this weird spot where he wanted the traditions, but they would cause more bloodshed. So he sort of had to go for the peaceful option and watch the things he loved die.
Exactly. So he's a very pragmatic guy. He was instrumental in implementing some of the changes that would kind of typify the Meiji government. So, for example, getting rid of the daimyo and replacing them with governors, removing some of the privileges of samurai, reforming the army, introducing conscription, and then just generally overturning things from the way they were into kind of a more recognizable modern society. He was doing all that because he knew is what had to be done, but yeah, it was kind of starting to suck the joy out of his life. The way he lived and the parts of his culture that he really appreciated were being kind of pushed aside in favor of modernity, and he could only take it so far.
And then an opportunity arose, a potential opportunity, when Korea started antagonizing Japan.
Yeah. So he thought, I'll give it one last hurrah. Maybe I'll take the Meiji government and we'll go over to Korea and I'll give the Koreans what for and show them that we are doing the right thing and that, we are a force to be reckoned with now.
An honourable battle.
Exactly. But it didn't turn out that way. He was kind of politically outmaneuvered by his colleagues and they kind of underhandedly tricked Koreans into attacking the Japanese and then said that was basically good enough. We've shown them what for because they didn't want to ruin the deficit. And this was the last straw for Saigo. He basically was like, I'm sick of this modernity. I'm sick of the lack of honor in this new Meiji government. So he handed in his resignation and he returned to Kagoshima, never to return to Tokyo. And that is, where we left him off last time.
Yeah, to try and live the simple life, wasn't he? So tell us, what does he do when he returns to Kagoshima?
So we're now in November 1873, and Saigo has returned to Kagoshima. He's feeling quite sad and reflective, and it's reflected in his poetry at the time. He's writing lots of poems about how he's rejecting consuming turbid, muddy water and is looking to instead drink pure, clean water. And I think that's kind of an indication that he's sick of the mudslinging and underhandedness of modernity and modern politics and wants to, as you say, return to this simple life, an honorable life, away from politics himself. However, there's a reason we're telling this story about Saigo Takamori. He was an incredibly influential person. He's probably the most famous person in Japan at this time. And his act of withdrawing from politics, unfortunately for him, even though it might have genuinely been sincere, he really didn't want to be involved anymore. It was an inherently political move. They're saying, well, if Saigo's not getting involved in the politics, then there must be something wrong with the politics themselves. So he is kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And this is the whole thing about this sort of final chapter of Saigo's life, is every decision he makes sort of seemed to lead back to this inevitable, the return to Tokyo.
Exactly. He's sort of, kind of a tragic, doomed figure at this point. No matter what he does, he's going to be sucked back into it. Well, as I say, everything he did was political. So he would go outside one particular day wearing a particular coloured kimono, for example, and all of his followers would be like, Saigo's wearing the purple kimono today. What does that mean? Maybe he's feeling regal because, purple's like a royal colour, and maybe that means he's going to try and overthrow the government. All this kind of nonsense and conspiracy was starting to kind of form around him. I likened it to the QAnon kind of Q drops where all of his followers like pouring through everything he did, trying to find some political meaning in it, even if he didn't mean it to be, basically.
The more withdrawn you are, the more mysterious you become.
Exactly.
And therefore, the more interesting.
Exactly. There was a vacuum created by Saigo leaving politics, and to fill that vacuum, rumor and conspiracy basically rushed in to fill his place.
So, what's going on then? What's he up to in this withdrawn life? What's he doing to fill his time?
Yeah, so at first he's quite bitter, to be honest, when he returns. But weirdly, he kind of comes back, and although he was one of the instrumental guys in removing a lot of the power of the samurai, right, he comes back and all the samurai in Satsuma, you'd think would probably be like, fuck this guy, Why is he, you coming back now? But they all just loved him for it. They could Saigo could do no wrong in their eyes, even though he'd been one of the main guys getting rid of the daimyo, for example. The daimyos were still like, Saigo, welcome back to the fold. And they just loved him and they followed him around. And he tried his very best to not become embroiled in their politics, but all of the kind of young Satsuma samurai around him were still extremely political, as they're looking for meaning in everything he did. But he was, as you say, returned to the simple life. He's doing what Saigo does best. He's kind of becoming a teacher again. Spends a lot of time kind of sitting around, like cracking jokes with children, showing them magic tricks. And, he goes back to hunting and fishing a lot and making his straw sandals. And generally just kind of hanging out.
This is sort of a mirror of his exile, isn't it? This moment, going back to teaching kids, finding the simple life, a sort of beautiful last moment, I guess, of bliss and joy.
Yeah, exactly. You could sort of see it as like a calm before the storm, perhaps. He's trying to turn away from things, but yeah, he just sort of can't. And it was sincere. When his old sort of political colleagues would turn up in Kagoshima to see him, they'd come to the door, they'd knock and they'd be like, "Is Saigo home?" And his wife would be like, "Oh, yeah, I've just seen him." And he'll have disappeared. He'll have sort of jumped out the back window and legged it into the woods to go. I'm not even kidding. He literally would run away from people so he didn't have to talk about politics with them. And he'd just go like fishing for 3 days with his buddies and come back. And then, that important politician that had turned up had gotten sick of waiting and had left. The only thing you could really say that was potentially political was he was instrumental in, at this time in Kagoshima, setting up a series of private schools that were designed to focus the energies of these samurai who were back in Kagoshima with nothing to do really under the new Meiji system. There is no war anymore to fight. They're not in the national army, so what do? He decided better than kind of having all of these sort of slightly disaffected youth hanging around, he'd set up these private schools that they could go to, and again, they'd focus on learning Confucianism. There'd be a kind of a pseudo-military aspect to it where they would be in kind of squadrons again, similar to the Goju that we talked about in the first episode. And
keeps them off the streets, keeps them from getting into trouble.
Keeps their nose clean. But it wasn't requested by the Meiji government that he do this. It was sort of, again, building a system outside of the system that was required of Satsuma.
And from the Meiji government's perspective, he could be seen to be militarizing a new generation.
Possibly. You can see it as quite antagonistic.
Yeah.
Some guy who had just kind of thrown his toys out of his pram, he'd quit the Meiji government and he goes back to his homeland and you start hearing rumors of him sort of setting up these schools of disaffected, angry Satsuma soldiers, and again keeping them training militarily and drilling with weapons, and it could definitely be seen to be antagonistic for sure.
And so it all comes to a head at some point. I imagine the great gravity of Saigo and the great gravity of the Meiji government, they have to pull each other together.
Yeah, exactly. So they're definitely on a collision course. There were rising tensions between the Meiji government and the Satsuma domain, not so much Saigo himself personally. Satsuma had been conveniently ignoring many of the rules set by the Meiji government. For example, Satsuma was the only domain in the country that's governor was from Satsuma. Everyone else had one given to them by the central government, but the Satsuma guys, they've always sort of been treated with, sort of white gloves, really. And that Satsuma government had essentially been ignoring some of the things the Meiji government had demanded they do. For example, I mentioned across the past few episodes, there's a thing called a stipend where the samurai are basically given a salary by their daimyo. The Meiji government had taken this over and had centralized samurai stipends, so no longer was a daimyo paying it. It was all coming from the central government. But what they had done is they tried to set national standards where they'd gotten rid of the class system within samurai.
The 10 levels of
10
samurai,
levels, yeah. So every samurai just got the same stipend.
Ooh.
So obviously the guys at the bottom, that's great. They probably went up a bit. The guys at the top,
with all the influence and power,
losing.
Not happy.
Probably, not very happy. Satsuma had essentially just ignored this. Tensions were rising to a point where the Satsuma actually banned any of their students and kind of young men from traveling out of the domain to study. So there's kind of this isolation is like us versus them building. And in amongst this, again, Saigo is there, but he's trying to stay out of it. But as I say, he's so politically important that his staying out of arguments was always kind of seen as taking a side of the Satsuma domain. So the Satsuma guys would be like, you can't leave, and Saigo wouldn't say anything. And they're thinking, okay, he agrees that they can't leave because he's not saying that they can't. So again, to the Meiji government, it still looks like Saigo is playing an important role from the outside.
So the samurai identity is completely changed now.
Yeah.
What does this do to this young generation?
Well, they're obviously not very happy about it. There's a moment in the Last Samurai, the film, where they go to visit Edo or Tokyo, and
they cut his hair off.
Yeah, they cut his top knot off. They try to arrest him for carrying swords. Okay, so that actually happened by this point. This is kind of one of the last few major attacks on samurai culture. So they banned the public wearing of swords. It doesn't actually say anything. I couldn't find anything about the removal of the top knots and wearing kind of samurai hairstyles, but they basically meant that you couldn't carry swords. And obviously, as a samurai, that is like your entire culture. You are an armed warrior, and all of a sudden, the central government is going, you cannot be armed. Satsuma, they had no intention of agreeing to this, and as such, the Meiji government demanded that the governor of Satsuma resign. Then the entire Satsuma kind of governmental structure threatened to resign if this guy was forced to resign. So the Meiji government backed down, but you can kind of see at this point, they're really antagonistic against each other, and the Satsuma are starting to kind of go their own way and does not agree with anything that the centralized government said. This, in some areas, erupted into kind of violent outbursts. With one point, there was an attack on Kumamoto Castle, which will come up again in just a moment, where 200 kind of furious samurai scaled the castle walls in the middle of the night and basically murdered everyone in there. And these rebels were known as the Divine Wind Party.
Great name.
Great name.
They would have done well at the Battle of the Black Gate.
They certainly would have done. They were shortly defeated afterwards, but you can kind of see that the pressure has now been applied to such a point that people are starting to think fighting with the Meiji government is better than sticking around and being kind of put under the thumb by them. Saigo is looking at these guys with torn emotions. He's proud of the rebels because he can see that they're standing up for samurai ideals, and he agrees with it. He's not a fan of the centralized government anymore.
But he doesn't want another civil war.
No, exactly. He doesn't, at this point, he still doesn't want a war with the centralized government. So he's like, yeah, good for you guys. I'm not getting involved. But he's kind of got like that old man from the sidelines being like, go get him, boys. But he's not going to get involved just at this point. And he's hoping that these kind of violent outbursts would show the Meiji government the error of their ways. People are violently angry with how quickly you're changing things.
But it's causing entrenchment, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So Saigo, whilst this is all happening, Saigo leaves Kagoshima for an extended hunting trip, possibly trying to physically detach himself from the politics.
Get away from it all.
Yeah, and so he goes away for a few weeks. And whilst he's away, events essentially overtake him. So firstly, the students from his schools that he'd set up began to talk of rebellion. Next, there were spies from Tokyo found in Kagoshima, showing that, the Meiji government is kind of in amongst their ranks. And then finally, an assassination plot was uncovered, and the target was Saigo himself. So this is all happening whilst he's away. And he comes back, and he learned all of this on his return. He tried his best to stay out of things, gone away, he wasn't getting involved, and the Meiji government had now physically come for him, even though he was trying his best.
So sort of like when he attacked Keiki's castle, forcing Keiki to do something, this is kind of similar. His honor has been specifically targeted.
Exactly. Yeah, you're kind of bang on there. The only problem is rebelling against the Meiji government was rebelling against the emperor. He likes the emperor. The emperor was the whole point for essentially his entire political career, was to put the emperor in charge. He now just doesn't like the Meiji government that the emperor has put in place. And you kind of get a good idea of this in the Last Samurai, in that scene where the government is making decisions and the emperor is there in the corner kind of watching, and he's supposed to have the ability to agree or disagree or veto things, but he won't, because he is a figurehead. So although he was loath to become a rebel against the emperor's government, he now had to do something. And his initial plan was very typically Saigo. He essentially announced that he would travel to Tokyo himself and confront the Edo government, the Tokyo government.
But this doesn't happen, does it? He gets joined by a bunch of soldiers, right? It's a bunch of out-of-work soldiers. And I just want to take this moment to maybe talk about potential rewriting of history here. There's a very thin line, slight difference in opinion between Saigo reluctantly being dragged into a rebellion, which, spoilers, is what's happening next. I mean, you've obviously got your sources for this, but you've got a god emperor, you've got a government you've just been a part of. He has made this potentially very good story about how much he's tried to stay out of it, and he's been dragged back in, and now he's just too liked and he's just too politically sought after. And then he's going off to Tokyo himself, and these group of soldiers forced themselves to come with him.
Yeah, no, good point. I mean, he could have if he really wanted to confront them personally, he could have snuck away in the night and gone and done it, but he sort of announces that he's going to Tokyo to confront the government. And he knows how important he is politically because he keeps trying to get away from it, because everyone keeps trying to drag him into things. He knows he's this kind of like gravity well of like of politics. People just kind of get sucked towards him. So yeah, you're very right. However, there's that saying that, history is written by the victors, and spoiler alert again, Saigo doesn't win this, but he still comes out of the other side looking like this kind of reluctant hero. And, I think if there was some situation where the Meiji government really wanted to kind of make him look bad and be seen as this rebel, well, there sort of would be that. But there just doesn't seem to be. Even before his death, in all of the newspapers across Japan, people are kind of lauding him as this sort of saint. They know he's going to die soon. There's all this artwork, all of the newspapers of kind of him looking down on Japan from heaven. Nobody, even really in the Meiji government, seems to sort of hate him. They just know he's doing what he thinks is right.
But we know he's politically very savvy. We know he's made it this far purely off the back of sort of his own image, I guess. I guess it's that impossible to define thing in history. Are they at this position of power because they're just that good at playing the game? Or because they just so naturally perfectly fit into that type of role that rises up through the ranks? Does that make sense?
I know what you mean. I don't personally see him as like a sort of political animal. I think he's obviously very reluctant to be in politics. He keeps trying to quit. People keep dragging him back into it. And I think he genuinely did just want to be left alone. But if someone comes to your town and tries to murder you, for years, you're like, please, I don't want to be involved. If someone comes and murders you, you'd probably be pretty angry as well. There's probably some righteous kind of indignation.
Yeah, I suppose. And it makes for a much better character and a much better story.
Yeah, so, it does.
It's just worth thinking about, I suppose.
Oh, no, totally. So, you're right. Basically, when Saigo announces he's going to Tokyo, for all intents and purposes, Satsuma is now at war with the Meiji government. There are around 12,000 samurai in the Satsuma domain who all immediately flood to Saigo's banner and decide that they're going to accompany him to Tokyo. So now there is an army on the march. So in the deep snows of February 1877, Saigo marches north from Kagoshima. They are carrying all of their own supplies. They're essentially fueled by their love of Saigo and his mission. And there's a lot of interviews with some of these soldiers, like after the war happens. They're like, why are you going? And a lot of them are essentially just saying, I don't really know, but if Saigo knew why he was going, then that was good enough for me. That's how they feel about him. Like
That's nice.
I mean, it's nice for Saigo.
And just on this heavily armed weaponry that they have, they also are using modern weapons as well.
The Satsuma,
unlike the Last Samurai.
Unlike the Last Samurai, so the Satsuma were pretty heavily armed. So they would have had rifles, mortars, artillery.
So it's a modern war.
At first. But they can only carry about 200 rounds each, these soldiers, because they're carrying everything they can. And facing them is the central army of the Meiji government, which is about 45,000 men, very heavily armed, hundreds of pieces of artillery, and yet 2 Gatling guns. And at this point, the nascent Japanese arms industry is producing nearly 500,000 rounds of ammunition per day. It's 500,000 rounds of ammunition per day versus the 200 rounds of ammunition that Saigo's soldiers are carrying. So essentially, time is not on Saigo's side. The longer this goes on, the better it's going to be for the Meiji government, because they have a military-industrial complex supporting them, and modern warfare is essentially won by these military-industrial complexes. Saigo doesn't have any of that.
He just wants one quick, decisive battle.
Yeah. The official purpose of the rebellion, as I say, was to accompany Saigo, but you can kind of assume that he probably would have gone with or without this army. He would have gone to Tokyo. And because of this, Saigo was going to pretty quickly learn that he'd, in essence, launched a rebellion without a cause.
He had no real purpose, no real end goal.
He wanted to confront the government.
He wanted to be like, oi, why'd you try to kill me? Leave me alone.
Yeah.
Well, great.
Yeah.
It's not very noble of a mission, but...
Well, I mean, it's noble for him, because he's pretty aware that, if he turns up in Meiji, they'll probably have him executed.
Yeah, well, he's always looking for a good way to die, isn't he?
He's been looking for a way to die since the first episode.
Yeah, and he might just find it.
Yeah. So on the 21st of February, they're approaching Kumamoto Castle, which I mentioned just earlier. They're about 3 miles from it when government troops see Saigo hit his army and they open fire on them. There's a small little skirmish and they get pushed back by Saigo's forces to the castle. And they think, all right, there's a castle there. Let's take it. It's in the way. So Saigo's rebels bravely attack the castle. They're kind of like swords in their teeth, climbing up the side under a hail of fire. But the defenders are repulsing their attacks. They've got loads of energy. They just keep attacking. As soon as one attack is repulsed, another would swarm forward. But again, modern warfare is now the state of play in Japan. And so it starts taking a toll pretty quickly on Saigo's forces. Say they've got land mines, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery, all that kind of stuff. And by the 24th of February, so 2-3 days later, the attack had essentially tapered off. And they were like, right, we'll have to put this castle under siege. And as I mentioned, Saigo's rebellion, if it's going to have any chance of success, needs to be quick.
This battle, this siege going on here, it is sort of, besides the weaponry, it still has that essence of one side is samurai versus an army that's sort of centralized, has conscription, sort of more of a modern army in the way that it's formed, rather, let's say, than its weaponry.
Yeah, totally. And it would have visually probably looked like that as well. As we say, the Satsumas have refused to enforce the law where they're not allowed to carry swords. So they would have all been carrying swords and they would have been fighting potentially conscripted soldiers with rifles.
Wearing westernized
clothing. These guys probably wearing more traditional.
So there would have been a big visual difference here.
Yeah, Saigo never adopted any sort of Western garb in any sort of manner of fact. So it would have visually still looked like samurai, but with rifles fighting, I don't know, British or French soldiers that happen to be Japanese type thing. Yeah, so the siege, the attack is tapering off and the siege is now kind of surrounding the castle. And still, everywhere Saigo goes, people like the locals are rising up and kind of joining him. He's joined by lots of other samurai from other domains who are kind of angry with him, but still, it's the forces he needs. He's probably got 15,000 men at most, whereas he has 45,000 men kind of bearing down on him. And the siege goes on for a few weeks. By kind of early March, say March 9th, March 10th, the castle had still not been taken, and the Meiji government, by this point, had landed troops via ship in Kagoshima, where Saigo had left a few weeks earlier. So now his retreat has been cut off. And Saigo is now very aware of his situation.
Momentum which he needed to win has run out.
Exactly. You can see from his letters and his writing at this point, basically knows he's not going to win anymore and is now just looking for a way to die honorably.
Wow. Well, let's see if he finds it after the break.
Yeah, indeed.
Bye-bye.
Hello and welcome back. Let's carry on with the story of Saigo Takamori.
Yeah, we're surrounded. He's run out of supplies. He's feeling hopeless in his little soppy letters.
Yes. His incredibly emotionally beautiful poetic letters.
Well, I have to read them to believe them.
You're saying you didn't do any of the research?
What? No. Anyway, government forces?
Yes.
Or something?
So Saigo, he's still slogging away at the siege of Kumamoto, but to Saigo's great disappointment, a force of some 10,000 men of the Meiji's centralized army arrived to relieve the siege of Kumamoto. So to deal with this, Saigo split his forces, and he met them with around 10,000 of his own men on this highway, kind of wrapping around a hill with sort of forests on either side, kind of dug into the side of a hill, that sort of highway. You can imagine them kind of going up like that.
He had 12,000 samurai before. He's been bolstered by more people on his way.
Yeah.
And so now he's got enough that he can split his army and put 10,000.
So he's left some guys to man the siege. Sure. And he takes 10,000 men. And so you can imagine the army's kind of marching in column around this hill. There is sort of raised banks on either side covered in woods. And so as they're going, there are samurai kind of running out of the bushes and ambushing them. And it's kind of a pretty nasty place to attack. Very dense vegetation and essentially a natural defense. So Saigo's forces meet with the Meiji forces. And then there's this brutal 18-day battle for this section of highway. Yeah. And so this is hand to hand. They're fighting with swords and spears and bayonets and whatever ammunition they still have. It's absolutely gory. So 10,000 men on either side. They probably each lose 4,000 men trying to take this hill.
What a slaughter.
Yeah, which is pretty devastating numbers for either side. But for Saigo's forces, it's completely devastating numbers because he's now lost a third of his army, which essentially makes his defense, his siege of the Kumamoto castle, completely untenable because he has no reinforcements coming, but the Meiji government has another 35,000 troops on their way.
And this must be crushing for morale. I mean, even with Saigo as your leader, it's only so far a soldier could probably mentally take this.
Exactly. 18 days. It's kind of a sign again of the creeping modernity. You know, battles, even the Battle of Sekigahara, 250 years before, where the shogun became the Tokugawa shogunate, one of the biggest battles in Japanese history, lasted a day. Now these little skirmishes are lasting 3 weeks. And this is a trend that will continue into the First World War, where you have battles lasting 3 months.
People entrenched.
Exactly. So trenches and yeah, the kind of horror of modern warfare is truly taking hold. So yeah. On top of this, it rained the entire time. So really First World War stuff, mud and trenches.
Absolutely morale killer. Yeah. Not great.
And then eventually the Imperials, they break through on the 20th of March, cause the rebels to retreat to a town called Ueki. And then they hold the line again there until April the 2nd. So another 2 weeks of fighting for Ueki. Then the remainder of the Imperial reinforcements arrive, break the siege at Kumamoto after 54 days.
I mean, an impressive licking they gave them.
Yeah, I mean, you got to give it to Saigo and his sort of scrappy band of rebels. They turned up with sort of 200 rounds of ammunition each.
And absolutely no plan.
No plan at all. And they managed to flip that no plan into a pointless siege for 54 days that they didn't complete. And a battle that, I mean, yeah, they toughed it out, but they lost. So Saigo pulls his men back to a place called Hitayoshi. And by this point, yeah, the tide had truly turned for Saigo's army. So the Imperial army, they all arrive, they assault Hitayoshi, they defeat Saigo's army, and it completely changes the nature of the rebellion. The remaining rebels, they split up, and they leg it, and they kind of melt away into the countryside and form these guerrilla bands, and would keep fighting for quite a long time in this sort of protracted retreat that would end at Shiroyama in the hills overlooking Kagoshima. Saigo's ever dwindling force. Yeah, I mean, he probably had a few thousand men to start with, and it would be whittled down slowly in numerous battles. I mean, we fought 15, 20 little skirmishes every time he'd lose a few hundred men, which is, I'd love to see a film about it. Just constantly being caught, fighting, just about slipping away. There's all these stories of him sort of being surrounded on a hilltop, very William Wallace, and sort of fighting his way out of it. They think they've got him, and they come into the middle of it, and there's nowhere to be seen. Saigo's just managed to escape.
As if they were his politician friends coming around for tea, and he's jumped out the back window.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what's Saigo's mindset right now? What's he thinking?
Hard to tell exactly, because, well, most of the eyewitnesses that were with Saigo would die at Shiroyama with him.
Okay.
And he's not writing any letters at this moment. So it's kind of hard to piece exactly what his mindset was. Some would say that he was distraught and fatalistic and really just looking for death.
Sounds a bit like him, to be fair.
Yeah.
If I know Saigo.
He is a little bit fatalistic. You got to give him that. On the other side, some say that he was doing no fighting at all and was completely out of action due to a painful parasitic infection of the testicles.
Ooh.
Which you would think make anyone want to stab themselves in the stomach and get their head chopped off. But as I say, it's hard to tell. On the other side, some say he was kind of distracted, would often slip away from his bodyguards and go spend days in the woods with his few remaining friends, like hunting and kind of pretending it wasn't happening before kind of getting himself together, coming back to his soldiers, and then carrying on the fight. Either way, it's hard to tell which one of those is true, but by sort of early August, he basically come to terms with his defeat.
So he spent a whole summer sort of slipping away through the woods.
Yeah, fighting, killing, slipping away, doing a bit of hunting, potentially having enormous swollen testicles.
All good summer fun.
Exactly,
Isn't it?
because some fun activities. But yeah, this is kind of around August, we start to get a bit more evidence again in the historical record as he circled an order to his men, basically saying for them to leave no shame for the hereafter. Essentially saying, we're done, lads. Die with honor.
Die with honor.
Yeah. So with this in mind,
Hardcore stuff.
he traveled south through Kyushu towards Kagoshima, and in September, Saigo and a few hundred of his remaining followers snuck back into Kagoshima, which we remember had been taken by the Meiji government a few months earlier in this war, and went up to the hills of Shiroyama, which overlook Kagoshima, and began essentially digging trenches. Obviously, they weren't hiding anymore. They were letting the Meiji forces know that they were there, but they were sort of building defenses for their last stand.
Here we are, come and get us.
Exactly, they returned home to die, essentially. Yeah, they had little food, little ammunition, no medicine, but they were all prepared to sell their lives dearly.
Come home to die. It's not the first time Saigo's done that.
No.
Probably thinking about his friend right about then. You know,
Exactly.
maybe he could see it from his hill.
I probably could. From the hill of Shiroyama, you can look out over Kagoshima into Kagoshima Bay. First time he tried to kill himself. And this time, yeah, the entire forces of the Meiji government were coming to do that job for him. And this is what would become known as the Battle of Shirayama. Really famous. There's all sorts of films of the Last Samurai about it. There are songs written about it. There's all sorts. It really is one of the kind of legendary moments of Japanese history. So let's talk about it a little bit. So the Imperial forces in Kagoshima, often seeing Saigo, all of a sudden they look up on the hill, it's like a trench line.
Yeah.
Like, oh, weird. Okay. But they marched up the hill and they quickly surrounded Saigo's position and began a lengthy artillery bombardment. Again, another sign of...
Very World War I, that.
Yeah, long artillery bombardment. Sign of the wars to come, indeed. And on the 23rd of September, the Imperial commander sent Saigo a letter saying, you done it, man. Like, what else do you have to prove? You have evaded the Meiji government for half a year. We all love you for it. We all kind of secretly wish we were doing it. You know, why don't you just surrender and then all your men will be spared?
And what does he say back?
Didn't say anything.
Silence.
Silence, indeed. So at 3:55 a.m. the following morning, the Imperial Army abruptly stopped its artillery barrage and began its final assault on Shiroyama. It would have been probably in the dark, 3:55 in the morning in September.
Moonlight glinting off rifle butts.
The Imperial forces are marching up the hill. The samurai, seeing the approaching Imperials, decided, let's just get stuck in. And they all jump out of their trenches and they charge, swords drawn. They've got no ammunition left at this point. Straight into the Imperial troops in the dark, who again were not trained for close quarters combat. These were now sort of line infantry. And yeah, all of a sudden they have 300 extremely skilled swordsmen in their midst, kind of cutting them to pieces.
With nothing to lose.
Absolutely nothing to lose. They're all expecting to die anyway. And yeah, the Imperial battle line begins to quickly collapse. The feudal weaponry of Saigo and his samurai managed to temporarily hold off the tide of modernity at Shiroyama. But in the thick of this fighting, where Saigo was right in the middle of it, leading it, he took a wound to his femoral artery.
Where's that?
It's in the leg.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a bad one.
Have you seen Black Hawk Down?
I have not. No, but the Romans, didn't they used to stab at the femoral artery to try and kill people? Groin stabbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of in there. Yeah, there's a pretty intense scene in Black Hawk Down where a guy gets shot in the leg, gets hit in his femoral artery, and the guy's trying to kind of put in there and clamp it shut. It's a great film, worth a watch. Take that, and so he's sort of carried back from the battle line by his comrades, and there he gets on his knees, overlooking the sun rising across Kagoshima Bay, and it's there that he commits seppuku. Pulls out a short sword, stabs himself in the belly, drags it across, and then it has his head quickly taken off by one of his colleagues.
And that's it.
And that's it.
There ends Saigo Takamori.
There ends Saigo Takamori indeed. So the Battle of Shirayama yeah, it didn't last very long, and it was essentially a crushing defeat for Saigo and his forces. They only killed about 50 Imperial soldiers and were completely wiped out. So, still,
Don't think they were planning to do much better, to be honest.
no, indeed. But Saigo, the man, the myth, the legend, died at that battle. It's kind of funny. Apparently, there is a sort of an ancient Japanese tradition where the head of the defeated is presented to the commander of the victorious army. So, when Saigo had his head cut off, his friend ran away with it and hid it so that his head couldn't be presented. And so the morning after the battle, there was sort of hours spent by the entire army looking for Saigo's head because they found his body, his enormous body with no head.
Did they find his head?
They did eventually because the guy had to like sort of quickly bury it. And they did eventually
No
find his
great
head.
mystery of the missing skull of Saigo Takamori or something.
No, but that was what would have been on everyone's mind the day after the battle. It was like, where the hell is Saigo's head?
Living rent-free in people's heads even after his death.
Yeah, exactly. Even when he
being
lost
the centre of attention.
his own head, indeed.
And that was the end of the rebellion, I assume.
So that was the end of the Satsuma rebellion. It was also effectively the end of feudal samurai culture in Japan as well. And it also had some other impacts. It was so costly, the Japanese government trying to constantly chase these guys around Japan, that they actually had to borrow so much money that they went off the gold standard and started having to use paper money because of the Satsuma rebellion. So
Debt. The modern world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they, another thing, inadvertently, Saigo had pushed the Japanese country further into modernity by forcing them to use paper money because of how expensive trying to kill him was. So, what does Saigo represent today?
I mean, it's a hell of a story. It's a hell of a death. And so maybe we all project this idea that he was, the last samurai fighting for samurai culture, but he wasn't really. Well, that's the question. If Saigo wasn't there to fight the good fight, would there be a different figurehead who represented sort of fighting against the end of Japanese culture? I mean, for Japan, I guess he is sort of the symbol, not to speak Japanese. I've never actually spoken to a Japanese person about Saigo Takamori, but I imagine he sort of speaks for this tradition. Because digging into the story, he's sad about it, but he doesn't seem to be ever actually actively rebelling against it.
No, true. And I think we now see this now potentially he was the last kind of true samurai, but I don't think the samurai who had fought against him and killed him would have considered him the last samurai. I don't think the Japanese truly considered that samurai culture had died even until maybe the bombs were dropped on them in the Second World War. There was an enormous amount of slightly terrifying samurai culture by Japanese soldiers in the Second World War, still using katana, still beheading people, not taking prisoners.
Committing seppuku.
Yeah, indeed. So, but I still think, he is obviously a tragic figure. You can see in this last episode that his fate was kind of preordained in a way. He wanted...
Where was the point where he could have got off the train track, I guess, that sort of led to this? It's a tricky question. Maybe if you'd refused to come back from exile all those years ago.
If you'd stayed in Kumamoto. I don't know. I think maybe if he had, after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, had not gotten involved with the Meiji government at all, which was his initial plan, but he was sort of pressured into it. I think if he had just then retired...
But then all these things would have gone ahead anyway, and maybe, who knows, in a circular way, he could have come to represent the antagonistic side to the Meiji Reformation just by doing what he's doing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think you're right. Even if he'd retired then and
he would have been refusing call-ups to the Meiji government, I assume, and therefore people would have seen him as against it.
Yeah, exactly. I think what the Meiji government did would have gone ahead without him anyway, and he still would have been on the receiving end of it.
I think, he helped to build this modern world, but he himself did not have the personality to live peacefully in it, I think.
No, exactly.
Fair to say.
He was a man of the past, and there was no place for him, really, in modern Japan.
I mean, like we just said in this episode, it wasn't just him who wasn't happy. It was thousands and thousands of people. And, if he wasn't the one leading it, he probably would have died somewhere in this rebellion anyway.
Yeah.
Because it's just who he was. But because of him, samurai culture sort of continues into the modern day. So in a way, his rebellion was effective, maybe not in what he wanted, but
I think also there's a lot to be said about, well, realistically, the negative aspects of what samurai culture represent, which was essentially an armed upper class keeping the vast majority of the Japanese people under the thumb at the end of a sword. And I think maybe what Saigo's story does, sort of this tragic rebellion, is it maybe kind of allows people to attach a positive view, saying that like Saigo was the true samurai. And maybe if he wasn't there, we'd actually have a much more kind of negative view on samurai. But you can look at characters like Saigo who truly were these heroic, impressive figures, and not just armed bullies with swords. I don't know. Maybe
that's a very good point. Yeah,
maybe it allows us to take a look at them in a more positive light.
Yeah, he did great stuff for samurai PR.
Exactly.
Just at the end.
So, even now, you can visit Kagoshima. It's still there. Still a big, important city in Japan. And if you happen to be in Kagoshima, you can take a trip up to the hill of Shiroyama, where Saigo breathed his last. On this hill, you will find a statue of Saigo Takamori looking out over the city towards Kagoshima Bay, still dressed in his traditional clothing, wearing his beloved straw sandals on his feet, sword at his side, even though he wasn't allowed to carry one in his last days. He walks a dog and wears a contented smile on his face. The Japanese people have decided to remember him as he was. He was a man deeply divided by the choices he made in life. He was a warrior and a scholar, political animal and a peaceful fisherman, a man of the past who brought Japan into the future. Thanks, Saigo.
Right.
That was good, wasn't it?
That was really good. So, that story compared to The Last Samurai, what are your thoughts? I feel like that was a far more powerful last stand for the samurai than is shown in the films.
Yeah, I think what the film does very well is obviously it's beautiful and it's a great film, but it massively simplifies the whole thing.
Which you have to, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really show Katsumoto as the sort of torn figure who, didn't really want to rebel and actually wanted a lot of the changes that Saigo helped enact. But, he sort of seems to be against all of it in the film and then dies happily as a man of the past, whereas Saigo's actually a bit more complicated than that.
I think so.
Yeah, I think enough said on The Last Samurai.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this series. You can join us next time. We're going to take a step away from Japan, and we're going to be heading to the Middle East. In our next series, we're going to be following the film The Kingdom of Heaven, another film directed by Ridley Scott. He does do a lot of historical films, so we've done a lot of Ridley Scott. So
yeah, he does.
And we'll be using the Kingdom of Heaven film to allow us to explore the Crusades, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Yes. Requiescat in pace, or whatever they say. Assassin's Creed.
That's Assassin's Creed.
Anyway, goodbye.
Goodbye. See you then.